Hi, and welcome back to another one of our online lectures here in World History. Today we're going to look at early Japan. Now, this unit focused heavily on China, but the Japanese are important too. Their history might not be quite as old as the Chinese. The Chinese have been around for 4,000 years and have had a rich culture with written language, and the Japanese have been around a long time too, but not quite that long. So we're going to look at some comparisons here. We're also going to look at some highlights that really set the Japanese apart. So we have one constructive response question. The question says, describe feudalism in Japan, and specifically how the samurai were a part of it. So we're going to talk about what feudalism is, and we're certainly going to talk about the samurai. You're going to notice that feudalism is a political hierarchy with many different roles. So we're not only going to list those roles, but we are going to focus on how the samurai really were a unique part of it. Samurai are just really kind of interesting. They don't exist anymore. For those of you who go to Elk River High School, I highly recommend you take my history through film class as we watch the film The Last Samurai, and we learn about what actually happened to the samurai and why they don't exist in Japan anymore. But I digress. We're going to look at feudalism and the samurai as part of this story today. So the three things we're going to look at, we'll start with Japanese geography. That's how we start with every civilization we study. Just kind of look at where they are, because in order to know who they are, we have to know where they are. So geography always matters. We'll talk about early Japanese culture, and then, like I said, we will finish by looking at Japanese feudalism and talking about the samurai. So let's set the stage. Japan lies just east of China. So there's definitely going to be some cultural continuity here. I mean, you're going to see some similarities between the Chinese people and the Japanese people, and that happens with a lot of groups that are in close proximity to one another. Japan got its name from the Chinese word Raibin, which means land of the rising sun. Oftentimes that's how Japan will be labeled, as land of the rising sun. If you look east any morning, you're going to see the sun rising, so the Chinese people would look east to where Japan is, and that's where the sun would rise. So that's where it gets its name from. Japan has borrowed ideas, borrowed institutions, and borrowed culture from China for thousands of years. That's not to say that they're not entirely unique, because there are some things that are very unique to Japan that the Chinese never had. But again, you see some cultural continuities, similarities in some of their art, similarities in some of their food and day-to-day living, and even some similarities in their writing a little bit. So Japanese records are not as old as China's, but its culture is still very rich and very unique. Again, the Chinese have been around for over 4,000 years, and the records in Japan don't date back quite that long ago, but we know there have been people in Japan for a very long time. So again, Japan lies just east of China, so here we see China moving directly east. Japan. There's going to be a lot of travelers that traveled through China, Korea, and Japan, bringing culture and spreading culture as they did that traveling. So again, cultural continuity. So the geography of Japan. Japan is made up of 4,000 islands, which make it something called an archipelago. That's a geographic term that means an island chain. From top to bottom, it's about 1,200 miles long. Historically, the Japanese have lived on the 4 largest islands, and these are the 4 islands that we are going to learn in this unit. So in the north, you have Hokkaido, right here. The big island just south of that is Honshu. Then you have Shikoku and Kyushu. Now, the way I always remember these, because I might hint, wink, wink, ask you this on a test, is I remember they go in alphabetical order, except for Kyushu. And I have an advantage because my name is Carl. It starts with a K. I always remember that the K island is the last one. So Hokkaido comes before Honshu. Honshu comes before Shikoku, not only geographically, but also in the alphabet. But Kyushu is the odd one that comes last. So I just remember that with a K. If that helps you, use it. If not, you may have to find your own device. But those are the 4 main islands of Japan, but there are many, many other islands as well. Southern Japan has a very mild climate with plenty of rainfall. It is a fairly nice place to live for that reason. But when it comes to agriculture and civilization, Japan is not super hospitable. Japan is very mountainous. with roughly only 12% of the land being suitable for farming. We said 10% in China, 12% here in Japan. So you really have to find ways to get resources in other ways. Certainly we know the Japanese in World War II went and got resources from many other countries as they invaded and took over most of East Asia. I'm not saying that that's right, but that is one means of getting the resources that you need. Specifically in that case, it was oil. So natural resources are definitely in short supply, like coal, oil, and iron ore. Because of its location out in the water, being islands, Japan has to worry about storms in a way that we don't necessarily have to worry about here in the United States. Certainly coastal regions, Florida, Texas, Louisiana, and the Carolinas have had their issues with hurricanes. But the rest of the inland states don't have to worry about that. But the Japanese do. So tropical storms called typhoons, which we call hurricanes in this part of the world, can occur during the late summer and early fall periods. And that can really wreak havoc on some of those islands. They also have to worry about earthquakes and tidal waves. They're also dangerous threats to the islands. An earthquake under the ocean may not affect us here in Minnesota, but an earthquake can cause tidal waves or tsunamis, which are significant threats to the Japanese. So that's always a worry about the people that live along the coast on those islands. All right, early Japan, a little bit about their culture here. The Japanese culture is very old. However, first written records only date back to the 1st century BC. So we're talking a little over 2,000 years ago. Again, the Chinese culture in comparison, we've got records that date back almost 4,000 years. So a big difference there. But during the 1st century BC, Japan was not unified as a nation. Instead, they had hundreds of clans that controlled their own territories. So you don't have like an emperor of Japan quite yet, but that's going to be coming here as part of this story. So early clan chiefs called themselves emperors, and that was gradually accepted into Japanese culture. So the people that ran these clans were called the emperors, and the Japanese people, as they slowly unify, will continue to use that term. So when one clan was defeated, the winning clan claimed control of the emperor, which could certainly cause a lot of conflict, as constant fighting in Japan was a regular thing from time to time. Each clan worshipped its own gods and goddesses. The early form of religion in Japan was something called Shinto. You're not going to see a huge amount of Christians or Muslims in Japan today. There are some, but a lot of people in Japan follow sort of these older folk religions like Shinto. So Shinto meant way of the gods. The gods in Japanese culture, again, similar to the Chinese, in that they don't have a lot of divine gods. It's not like the Egyptian gods or the Greek gods. They're more like spirits that dwell in nature. So Shinto was based on respect for the forces of nature and the worship of ancestors. Nature's always factored very heavily into Japanese culture. If you watch any Japanese films, you may see, so especially older films or even some of the animated films, you'll see that level of nature being a big part of that. The worshippers believed in something called kami, or divine spirits that dwelled in nature. So just kind of furthering that point there. All right, we're going to end part 1 there. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about the Japanese culture as well as feudalism, where the samurai fit in. So go ahead and end part 1 and cue up part 2.